Well, good morning, everybody. Am I on? Am I on now? There we go. Okay. All right, Stan's going to lead us in an opening prayer real quick, and then we'll get started. Stan?
Lord God in heaven, thank you, Father. Pray, Father. Morning, Eddie. Pray, Father, that you help us about Father. Thank you, Father. Ask help us show our love. Pray, Father, help us. Spirit. Father, we thank you. Love you, Father. We ask Father, we pray that you help us better.
Amen. All right, so we're continuing to look at the parting words of the wise. Wednesday, we started talking about Joseph. We should hopefully finish Joseph up today. And then Zach is going to start this coming Wednesday on Moses. So we were going over the life of Joseph in detail, and we left off in Genesis chapter 42, if you'll turn there with me. Genesis 42. And if you didn't bring your Bible, the Pew Bible right there in front of you, it's actually on page 42. And we've been following Joseph through the text, and right now the text is going to turn and talk about Joseph's brothers for quite a bit. This will probably be our longest reading today. If you'll follow me there in Genesis 42. And the famine has just started in Egypt, and actually across the land. And when Jacob saw there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. And he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's son. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." But he said to them, "No, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this manner you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." So he put them all together in prison 3 days. Then Joseph said to them the third day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined to your prison house, but you go and carry grain for the famine of your houses. and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore his distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, saying, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. So as this section just started, Jacob, not wanting anything to happen to Benjamin like it had to Joseph, he sent the other 10 sons to Egypt for food, and they meet Joseph, not knowing it, of course. First thoughts, why wouldn't they have recognized Joseph? He recognized them right off, but why wouldn't they recognize Joseph? Absolutely. I imagine he was wearing different clothes than what they were. That's one thing. What's that? He wasn't known as Joseph, exactly. Yeah, very much so. So he spoke through an interpreter. He's speaking a different language. He wasn't known as Joseph. You're referring to when Pharaoh changed his name to Zaphnath-Paneah. That's a bit far from Joseph. Yeah, he wasn't known as Joseph. And also, it's now been 22 years. They knew a 17-year-old teenager, probably pimply-faced, and now, 22 years later, I imagine he looked a little different. Now, Joseph recognized his brothers immediately, and then he remembered the dreams he has. They bowed down to him. Now, why do you think he speaks harshly to them and doesn't just run up and instantly forgive them? Remember, we read about how Esau did that with Jacob, right? Instantly. Jacob foresaw that there was going to be trouble, and he went through the trouble of protecting Joseph. And Esau just ran up to him, and they started hugging and giving kisses. I'm not looking for a long explanation here, just some first thoughts. Why do you think Joseph spoke to them harshly instead of just instantly forgiving them? Yeah, it could have been anger, maybe a revenge, I suppose. Yeah, maybe. What are some other reasons you think that he didn't instantly just forgive his brothers? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. He's saying if they had just given him the grain, they would have just gone back home. And this was happening because it was God's will. Thank you, Margaret. Let's see. And then we have this interesting scene here in 42 and 21. And the brothers are standing there talking about how this is happening because they did that evil thing to Joseph, and they're saying in their own tongue in front of Joseph. And Joseph is hearing them. And of course, they don't know it's him. They don't even know he can understand them. There we go. And it's just I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And were they right? Was this happening to them because of what they did to Joseph? Yeah. All right, so looking down in verse 27, I just want to summarize a little bit. One of my problems with teaching is I have kind of trouble condensing information down. And I was given 2 verses with 20 chapters to back it up. So I was like, okay, So we're going to summarize 27, starting in 27. So Joseph's brothers there, they find the money that we just read about. Remember, it was placed back in their sack. But they know they can't go back to Joseph without Benjamin. So they go home to Jacob and they tell him what happened. And of course, he's very bereaved by all of this. And he basically just says in verse 38, there at the end of chapter 42, that Benjamin is not going down there. Not happening. And then starting there in chapter 43, and remember Simeon has been is still in that prison that Joseph's put him in. And in chapter 43, the famine is severe in Canaan. It's still very bad, and they eat up all the grain that Joseph has sent them back with. And Jacob tells his sons to go back to Egypt and buy more grain. They say they aren't going to go without Benjamin because the Lord of the land had solemnly warned them. And they decide to go ahead and take double the money this time. Jacob relents and lets Benjamin go, but he severely stresses to them that Benjamin better come back or Jacob is going to be so bereaved that it's basically going to kill him. And then in verse 16, they're back in Egypt, and Joseph sees them, and he sees that particularly they brought Benjamin, and he tells his servants to take them to my house and prepare a big meal. And his brothers, are just here to buy grain, right? And they do have to deal with Joseph, but they're just here to buy grain and go home. And now they're invited to dinner at this Lord's house. And they're all kind of beside themselves, thinking that this must be because the money that we found in our sacks. That, oh, no, now it's coming. I think they're really about to get it, and that's why they're like, why are we going to this guy's house? And Joseph's steward, when they get to the house, Joseph's not there, but his steward is there, and he dismisses that thought and tells them not to worry about that. And then in verse 24, still in 43, the steward also gives them Simeon back. He washes their feet, he feeds their donkeys, and has them wait in Joseph's house for Joseph to get there. They've got to be confused by now, right? They're like, we're just sitting in this, I imagine was a pretty nice house. And they had not had a positive experience with Joseph thus far. Joseph shows up, and he pretends to not know Benjamin, and he meets him, and he asks about Jacob, and he's very overjoyed to see his brothers, but he doesn't let them know that. And then they all eat really well. Benjamin is served way more than any of his brothers. And then it's time to leave again. They all leave with sacks all fully loaded with sacks of grain. The money is again put back in their sacks. And very, very importantly, Joseph has his steward at his silver cup, put Joseph's silver cup from that meal in Benjamin's sack. So it looks like it's stolen, basically. That ends chapter 43, going into chapter 44. As a reminder of the silver cup, so they get down the road a bit, and Joseph's steward catches up and accuses them of stealing the silver cup and says, one of you has it. And the brothers say, we don't have it, we don't have it. When they're so sure that none of them have it, they say, you can kill the one who took it and make the rest of us slaves. Of course, the steward searches all the sacks, oldest to youngest, to draw it out, I think, because he knows it's in Benjamin's sack. Talk about a tense moment. And of course, he finds it in Benjamin's sack, and they all get taken back to Joseph, and he says, I'll keep Benjamin as a slave, but the rest of you go home in peace. And remembering their promise to Jacob they were for sure going to bring Benjamin back, they can't do that. And Judah steps up to plead with Joseph to let him and say, let me stay as a slave and let Benjamin go back. Otherwise, it would basically kill our father because he's going to be so bereaved. It's kind of actually interesting that Judah stepped up to be the slave because it was Judah's idea to sell Joseph into slavery in the first place. But anyway, that ends chapter 44. And that gets us to chapter 45. And there in 45, it says, and Joseph, if you're reading me in 45, starting in verse 1, and Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. Talk about a surprise, right? And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. So they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, for whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. As for these 2 years has been in the land. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years for which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler throughout the land of Egypt. So we just got a big answer here. Why did Joseph go through all of this trial that we were talking about Wednesday? Why did he go through all of that? God led him. What was God's purpose for it? To redeem the Israelites, to preserve life, to create a place for the Israelites to go to through Joseph. And that's in verse 5 and verse 7.
Hey, Eddie?
Yes.
You know, when you read this, you
Well,
think about when Paul was on the road to Damascus, Christ appears to him, and he tells him, I am the one that you're persecuting. Why do you kick against the goads? You know, and you kind of see the story of Christ here well, because Christ went through all of this. What purpose? Redeemed. And there was a plan, and Joseph was used in that plan to preserve life.
Absolutely. And David was saying, he was comparing Joseph and Jesus and the plan that was set aside for us, as well as the plan that we see Joseph living through to save the Israelites. So thinking on that same question again of why Joseph did this to his brothers, Margaret was saying it was God's will. But that is one answer, yes. But why would Joseph put his brothers through all of this back and forth, and why wait so long to reveal himself? Yes, it's God's will. I think there's a little bit more to that, though. Why would he do that? Yes.
What do you do before? Now. Satisfying question.
Yeah, I think that's a very good one. He's saying that, Nate was saying that it looks like he's testing him, and it kind of seems to be, he's satisfying his own question of what kind of men they are now. And now he's seeing repentant men rather than the sinful men that they were when he left them. Other reasons why he might have put him through all that, not just forgiven him right off. You think he was taking revenge on his brothers? Think this was a case of revenge in any way? I don't think so. I think Joseph was too wise for that. And, we have a lot of answers for this, but I think another one is that they needed to see his power, and more importantly, the power of God, they needed to see that. I think they needed to see what all he was over, what all he could do, because that's what God gave him to preserve their lives and raise up a nation. You know, they could have walked into Egypt and found a ruler who really thought they were spies and truly have killed them. You know, had it not been for Joseph there, they wouldn't necessarily have had food for them in Egypt in the first place, because remember, he's the one who went around for 7 years gathering food to hold on, you know, in Pharaoh's name. I mean, he tells them, God put me here. And I think that through this process, they could really see that God was with Joseph and with them in the way he did that. If you look at right there in 10 and 13, just below where we stopped reading, you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children's children, your flock and your herds, and all that you have. God was with his people, and he used Joseph to preserve them in this time. The rest of chapter 45 there is Pharaoh telling Joseph to send for the rest of his family and to move to Goshen. And then Jacob finding out that Joseph is still alive. In chapter 46, chapter 46 starts with God telling Jacob to go to Egypt because God would give him a great nation there. And then we have the lineage of the house of Jacob there. We see all the sons and a lot of grandsons of Jacob. And then there at the bottom it says, not the bottom, but there in 27 it says 70 people of the house of Jacob go into Egypt. So we have 70 people going into Egypt in a famine. 46 ends with the house of Jacob settling in Goshen because they are shepherds and they have to specifically be in Goshen, kind of isolated, I think, from the majority of Egyptian populace, I believe, because they're shepherds, and shepherds are abomination to Egyptians. And so they're in the land of Goshen, which apparently, the way Pharaoh was talking, he said he told Joseph to give him the best of the land, so I think that was the best of the land specifically for the shepherds. There in chapter 47, Jacob is introduced to Pharaoh. We find out how old Jacob is there. He's now 130 years old. Then we see more of how Joseph handles the famine. When the people needed bread, they came to him and traded him livestock. And then when Pharaoh owned all their livestock, then they came and traded him their land. So now Pharaoh owns all their land. And then Joseph institutes kind of a production of good tax for Pharaoh, and it's really just once the famine is over and they start producing grain again, they have to give 1/5 to Pharaoh. But they were fine with all that because they survived. They lived through the famine. And then chapter 47 there ends with Joseph swearing to Jacob that when Jacob dies, Joseph will have him buried in Canaan, on the land of his fathers. Zach is going to be covering Jacob's final words closer to the end of our class. So here in 48, I just want to pick out a couple verses. And if you'll read with me in chapter 48, starting in verse 3. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you, as an everlasting possession. And then in verse 48:14, and Israel stretched out his right hand, and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and the left hand on Manasseh's head, and guiding his hands knowingly for Manasseh, was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all of my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And then jump down to 21 for me, with me. And then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Jacob, that same thing, he says it 3 times, or very similar things 3 times right there in that one chapter. When he's first talking to Joseph, then when he's blessing Joseph's sons. And remember those verses we just read. I'm going to come back to them in just a second. And then in chapter 49, we have Jacob's last words, and then Jacob's death. And in chapter 50, Joseph has the body of Jacob prepared, and Pharaoh lets Joseph go and bury his father, as he has just sworn. As he swore to do. Do y'all remember who all went with Joseph to go bury Jacob? It's down in here a little bit. Anybody remember? What was that? The household. And so lots and lots of people went with Joseph to bury Jacob, right? It was a kind of a parade of people to go all the way up there and bury him. And then in verse 15 of 50, Joseph's brothers start to worry that Joseph will turn on them now that Jacob is dead. And they say as much to him, and they ask for forgiveness for what they did to him. And his reply, starting there in Genesis 50 and verse 18, then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. And Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save my people alive. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph knows what he went through, what all he did. He lived a life for God in all situations. This came out in last class. He was blessed, and by God's power, which he constantly points out, he saved the nation. God saved the nation through him. But Joseph had to do a lot of work in that. Now, is that the faithful act that he is remembered for, though? Working to save a nation. Is that the faithful act Joseph is remembered for? In Hebrews 11, in the heroes of faith, in verse 22, it says, by faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. The act of faith Joseph is mentioned for here in Hebrews 11 is those dying words that we read at the beginning of Wednesday. And when he said, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, and the land he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from here. And all that Joseph did in his life, this is what is recorded in Hebrews 11, are these words. So the act of faith Joseph is mentioned for is these dying words. What faith is shown by these words? What act of faith is that? Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely. He's saying he's fully believing in the fact of what God promised to Abraham was going to happen. That's what God was going to do. Now, does that seem like a gigantic act of faith? We just went through Joseph's life and last 2 days, and did he have conversations or appearances from God like Jacob did? Did he have any of those? He did live like he wanted to. We don't have a recording of it. And, he had the dreams from God, but appearances, I don't think so. Because in Moses went talking to God in Exodus 6. And 3, God says to Moses there, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But my name, Lord, I was not known to them. So he just says, he's saying there he appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, he could have just left off Joseph, but I don't think he appeared to Joseph. We don't have any recording of it. So if Joseph doesn't have these appearances from God, he mostly has the dreams and I think faith. And so what words of faith are these? I don't think he has any appearances when God was talking to Moses, and when God talking to Moses, I think confirms that. And he had the words of his father, and he had the words of his father, as we saw when Joseph is telling him, Joseph blesses his sons, and then as well in 3 and 4 and 21 of 48. And so I think that's where we see his faith, and also in God working in his life, right? That's where his faith. That's where he saw. I think he saw his faith from the promise passed down from generations, and then God working in his life. And when he said, "God will bring you up from this land, have our descendants take my bones with him," I think he knew and faithfully believed that God would restore a great nation to Canaan, right? See, Joseph, he gave Jacob this great parade of people to go bury Jacob, which Jacob, I think, was probably worthy of. But Joseph, he doesn't need all of that. He doesn't say, "Go bury my bones now." He says, when you go back, take my bones with you then. Now, how does all that help us? How does that faith help us? Yes. In appearance's sake. Yeah. Absolutely. And she was saying that we can have a faith like Joseph. Joseph didn't seem to have any appearances from God. He had the dreams, but he had a faith like we can have. She was getting out. Is there another hand over here? How else does this help us? Yeah, absolutely. Zach was saying he was relying on a promise, just as we are now. A promise. We're relying on the promise of heaven. Excellent point. She was pointing out that it shows a pattern of teaching our children and how they pass this knowledge down. And then if we stop, the children can end up in idolatry, as they later do. And remember, when we get into Exodus, the Pharaohs forget. There rises a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and that's when the persecution of the Israelites in Egypt really started. So the Pharaohs didn't pass down the knowledge of Joseph very well, and so yes, teach our children. Very good lesson to take away. Anything else anybody can think of? How does this help us? Yeah. Absolutely. That's really good. She was, Leanne, through Zach, was saying, we have we see we can see the ability to forgive through him. Joseph went through all that, right? Because his brothers threw him in slavery. But he saw God's providence in it, and he forgave his brothers for the life he was put through. Very good. So we have forgiveness. We have teaching. Can we see God working in our lives like Joseph did? Can we see God working in our lives? I think we can, right? Certainly learn from that. Can we trust the words passed down to us? Absolutely. I think those were two of Joseph's biggest sources of faith, was the words passed down to him and seeing God in his life. Can we live for God in our time and in all our time, in all of our trials? Joseph did that, right? Joseph, in his trials, still lived for God. He wasn't, as Stan pointed out, just trying to make the best of his life. He was working for God, and the best of his life was coming out, even in his affliction. And can we have faith and tell others of his promises and of his sacrifice to save and preserve life? That's what David was getting at, right? Just as Joseph was used to preserve life in that time, Jesus, we have the correlation here, was used and came and died to save and preserve life. So yeah, we can in all times tell others of the promises and of that sacrifice. And I ended 5 minutes too early. Yes, go ahead. Please. Yep.
I don't know all. Those things are now. You honestly
read it. That Joseph wanted to learn how in faith the right food. Maybe that's a great lesson. We don't know what to do. Doesn't mean we're going to live the rest of our life. When the door's open, but there were pretty obvious doors for promotion. Life.
Absolutely.
If you are willing.
Absolutely. You know, he was mentioning it's patience. And Joseph is a lesson of patience in that waiting for God to open doors and go through them when God said so. You know, thinking about that and not acting on in haste when we should wait on God. I think that's a good point, because he could have tried to escape from Potiphar and run back to his family. He could have tried to break out of prison and go back to his family. He could have done all kinds of things to get out of his trials, but we don't have him doing that. We see that he's trusting in God in the situations that he's in and waits on God to bless him and move him forward. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. He was saying that even when Joseph suffered injustice, he knew that God could still bless him in that. Yes, David.
One thing I see about him, actually, I was thinking about it one day this week whenever I was doing my studying, and I came across resilient characters in the Bible. They were resilient regardless of what they saw themselves going through, and they chose to continue to go forward. People around maybe ridiculing or telling people to give up, stuff like that, but they chose to put God first. And I was also thinking about, also in another study about spiritual warfare we go through, going over the whole armor of God. And sometimes we can think, okay, the belt of truth, helmet, I get it all mixed up. But anyway, when you think about it, when you put on Jesus, put on Christ, you clothe yourself with him, you've already put on the whole armor. So when you put Christ first, regardless of what situation you find yourself in, you can be just as Joseph. When he put God first, you become resilient. And knowing that, yeah, the time right now may be hard and difficult, but the one thing is that eventually you're going to keep pushing forward, and God's going to take care of it.
When relying on God, absolutely. He was talking about the resilience of Joseph and the lesson we can learn from that. Thank you for your kind attention and all of your comments today. Greatly appreciated. And Zach's going to start with Moses on Wednesday.